Sometimes, life puts us in situations where standing still feels like the hardest thing we'll ever do. It's in those moments when the world seems to turn against us, when voices try to silence us, when power tries to humiliate us, that we're faced with a choice. Do we shrink to make others comfortable, or do we hold our ground with quiet dignity? Ariana's story reminds us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to know that true strength isn't loud. It isn't reckless. It doesn't need applause. True strength is the courage to stand tall when you have every reason to sit down. It's the choice to speak up when silence would be easier. It's the wisdom to know that your worth is not defined by how the world sees you, but by how you see yourself. So, to everyone listening today, let this be a reminder: you've already earned your place in this world. You've already proven you belong. You don't have to fight every battle, but when the moment comes, don't be afraid to stand. Because sometimes, standing still is the loudest statement you'll ever make. And if this message spoke to you today, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear these words. We're here to remind you, you are never standing alone. A warm spring breeze drifted through downtown Savannah that morning, carrying with it the distant sounds of church bells echoing softly through the narrow brick alleys. The towering oak trees, with their long, draping Spanish moss swaying gently overhead, stood like silent witnesses to the history that had passed through these streets for over 2 centuries. The sunlight, filtered through their branches, danced across the courthouse steps as the crowd slowly gathered, filling the wide sidewalk with soft chatter, nervous energy, and the hum of anticipation. It wasn't every day that a case this big drew half the city to show up in person, but today was different, and everyone in Savannah seemed to know it. Some had come out of curiosity, eager to see justice served against a politician who, for years, had walked around like he owned the place. Others had come because they had seen the headlines, read the stories, heard the whispered rumors of corruption, cover-ups, and backroom deals. But a few had come for a different reason, entirely because they believed this hearing was about more than just one man on trial. It was about the system itself, about whether or not someone in power would finally be held accountable in front of the people who had suffered the longest. And standing quietly at the edge of that growing crowd, almost invisible in her poise and grace, was the one person no one expected to see in a place like this, not because she didn't belong here, but because she carried herself as if the whole world already knew she did. Ariana Bennett stood with her back straight, her chin slightly lifted, and her eyes steady as she took in the scene before her. She wasn't in a hurry, nor did she seem distracted by the buzz around her. If anything, she looked like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She wore a navy blue dress that hugged her frame just right, not too tight, not too loose-paired, with simple but elegant heels that clicked softly on the pavement with every measured step she took. Her long black wig, sleek and perfectly styled, framed her face like a crown, and as the morning sun caught the shine in her hair, it was hard not to notice the way people turned to glance, just for a moment, wondering who she might be. She didn't need to announce herself. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone was enough to stir quiet whispers among those who recognized her face, from television interviews or newspaper articularies that described her as one of the fiercest federal prosecutors in the Southeast. But today, she wasn't here to stand behind the prosecutor's table. Today, she was simply a citizen, a member of the public, showing up to witness justice with the rest of her community. And yet, deep down, Ariana knew that walking into that courtroom as a black woman, dressed with confidence, wearing success on her like a second skin, made her a target long before she even reached the doors. As she climbed the steps toward the courthouse entrance, she could feel the weight of every eye that followed her, not just admiration, but something heavier, something colder, like the tightening of a rope around her chest. It wasn't new to her. She had carried that weight for years, long before she ever won her first case or earned her seat at the table. But that didn't make it any easier to ignore. She breathed in slowly, steadying herself, reminding herself of who she was and what she stood for. "Keep your head high, baby." She could almost hear her mother's voice whispering in the back of her mind. "You belong in every room they try to keep you out of." Pausing at the top of the steps, Ariana turned slightly, her eyes scanning the faces below, elders from the church she grew up in, retired teachers she hadn't seen in years, Neighbors who had watched her grow from a shy little girl to the woman she was today. Some smiled at her with quiet pride, nodding their heads as if to say they saw her, they recognized her, and they were glad she had come. She returned their glances with the faintest smile, just enough to let them know she felt it too. And then, without another word, she turned toward the heavy wooden doors, placing one hand on the brass handle, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingertips. She pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside as the soft hum of voices outside faded into the quiet air of the courthouse lobby. The smell of polished wood, old paper, and coffee brewing somewhere in the distance wrapped around her like a familiar memory. She stood still for just a moment, letting the door close gently behind her, shutting out the world outside. Inside, the courthouse was alive with tension. Security officers stood posted near the metal detectors, their eyes darting between faces, scanning for anything that seemed out of place. Lawyers shuffled papers, adjusting their ties or smoothing their skirts, moving toward the courtroom doors with purposeful strides. Reporters whispered quietly into their phones, looking for signals, angles, anything to grab hold of before the hearing began. But Ariana, standing there in the center of it all, felt like the only person who wasn't rushing, the only one grounded enough to feel every breath she took. She adjusted the thin strap of her leather handbag on her shoulder, took one final glance around the lobby, and started walking toward the courtroom entrance. Every step she took echoed softly off the marble floor, a steady rhythm that seemed to grow louder with each stride, not because the sound had changed, but because the moment had. This was more than a hearing, more than a headline, more than a moment in time. This was something else entirely, and Ariana Bennett could feel it settling in her bones like a quiet storm waiting to break. And as she reached for the courtroom door, placing her hand gently on the brass handle once again, she closed her eyes for just a split second, breathing in one last time before stepping into the room where everything was about to change. The smell of cheap floor polish mixed with the faint trace of sweat and coffee drifted through the courthouse lobby like something that had settled into the walls over decades of hearings, trials, and public outbursts. Officer Bradley Cooper leaned back slightly against the edge of the security checkpoint counter, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his eyes narrowing as he watched the woman in the navy dress walk through the doors like she had every right to be here. He had been standing in that same spot every morning for nearly 7 years, and in all that time, he had seen people from every walk of life come and go through those doors. Some looked nervous, some looked defeated, and some looked like they were trying too hard to act like they belonged. But there was something about this woman, something about the way she carried herself that made his skin tighten, like an itch he couldn't reach. Bradley had grown used to the familiar rhythm of the courthouse, the steady shuffle of shoes on tile, the impatient sighs of lawyers checking their watches, the rustle of papers being pulled from worn briefcases. It was predictable, almost boring at times, and he liked it that way. He liked knowing what to expect. But this morning, watching that woman walk in like she owned the place, something about it rubbed him the wrong way, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just another face in the crowd. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing toward his partner, Officer Sanders, who stood a few feet away scanning IDs. Bradley leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough so that only Sanders could hear him. "You see her?" he muttered under his breath. Sanders barely glanced up, already bored with whatever Bradley was about to say. "The one in the blue dress." Bradley pressed, tilting his chin subtly in Ariana's direction. Sanders followed his gaze, shrugged without much interest, and went back to scanning the next person's identification card. "Looks like she knows where she's going," Sanders replied flatly. But Bradley wasn't satisfied with that answer. He leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone, the way men do when they're trying to convince someone of something they already believe themselves. "She's too polished, too sure of herself," he muttered, almost as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "I've seen it before. They show up like they own the place, thinking they're better than the rest of us." Sanders sighed, already tired of this routine. He had heard Bradley say things like this before about the man in the designer suit who turned out to be a janitor, or the older black veteran who had come to testify and ended up being treated like a trespasser. It was always the same pattern. Bradley didn't trust people who walked with quiet confidence, especially when they didn't look like the people he was used to seeing in charge. Bradley stood up straighter, his jaw tightening as he watched Ariana continue toward the courtroom doors. He couldn't explain why, but something in him stirred an unease wrapped in a strange kind of irritation that made his chest feel tight. Maybe it was the way she didn't even glance at him, like he wasn't worth noticing. Maybe it was the way the people in the lobby seemed to part for her without a single word being spoken, as if she belonged there more than he ever could. He shifted his hand toward his duty belt, fingers brushing the cool edge of his badge as if reminding himself of who he was and what he stood for. He had worked too hard to let people like her people, who walked in like they didn't have to answer to anyone, think they could just waltz past him without being questioned. He didn't care who she thought she was. This was his courthouse, his post, and no one got a free pass. For a moment, he debated whether or not to stop her right then and there, to demand to see her ID, to ask her what business she had here. But something held him back, not fear, not hesitation, but strategy. He knew if he called her out in front of the whole lobby, it might draw unwanted attention. No, better to wait until she was inside, when the crowd had settled, when no one was looking too closely. Then he could move in, ask the right questions, put her in her place without turning it into a spectacle. Bradley took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving Ariana as she disappeared behind the heavy courtroom doors. He clenched his jaw, grinding his teeth slightly, the muscles in his neck tightening. He could already picture the look on her face when he exposed her for whatever game she thought she was playing. He could already hear the quiet murmurs of the courtroom when he proved that she didn't belong here after all. But beneath all that arrogance, beneath all that certainty, there was something else, something smaller, something almost too quiet to hear. It was the voice he never admitted out loud, the one that whispered from somewhere deep inside, asking a question he refused to answer. What if you're wrong? Bradley shook the thought from his head like a dog shaking off rainwater. He had learned a long time ago not to second-guess his instincts. His job wasn't to make people feel comfortable. His job was to keep the courthouse secure, to make sure the rules were followed, to keep people in line. And if that meant making a few people uncomfortable along the way, so be it. He turned back toward Sanders, rolling his shoulders to shake off the tension that had started to settle there. "I'm keeping an eye on her," he muttered under his breath. Sanders didn't even look up this time, too busy with the next person in line. Bradley didn't care. He wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for control, and something told him that woman in the navy dress was about to give him the perfect opportunity to take it. And so, with his jaw set and his eyes locked on the closed courtroom doors, Bradley Cooper stood there, waiting, like a wolf just outside the edge of the light, convinced he already knew how the story was going to end. The heavy courtroom doors closed softly behind Ariana as she stepped into the long, rectangular room, immediately greeted by the low hum of quiet conversations rising and falling like ocean waves against the shore. The air inside felt heavier than the lobby, thicker somehow, as if the walls themselves held their breath alongside everyone who had gathered to witness what was about to unfold. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched from the back of the room all the way to the front, each one already filled with people sitting shoulder to shoulder, their eyes darting between one another, their hands fidgeting in their laps or gripping the edges of their seats. The faint creak of old wood echoed softly beneath Ariana's heels as she moved deeper into the space. Her steps careful, steady, unhurried. She could feel the air shift around her, feel the heads turning in subtle waves as people noticed her arrival. Some faces lit up with recognition, small smiles appearing like flickers of candlelight in a dim room. Others furrowed their brows in quiet suspicion, their eyes narrowing just enough to let her know they were watching, measuring, wondering if she was here as a supporter, a witness, or something else entirely. She scanned the room with the ease of someone used to reading people, catching small details in every corner, the church elders sitting near the back, their pressed Sunday suits and wide-brimmed hats looking slightly out of place on a weekday morning. The retired school teachers she hadn't seen since she was a teenager, whispering softly to one another, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the front of the room where the defense attorneys were already setting up their notes, and there, just a few rows ahead, her mother, Clara Bennett, sitting upright with both hands folded tightly in her lap, her face unreadable but her presence unmistakable. Ariana exhaled slowly, pressing her fingertips briefly to the strap of her bag as if to steady herself against the quiet storm brewing inside her chest. She knew her mother hadn't wanted her to come today. Clara had warned her, in that careful, measured way only mothers know how to do, that showing up in person, especially here, especially now, would put her under a microscope far larger than any courtroom had ever held. But Ariana had come anyway, not to make a statement, not to draw attention, but because something inside her refused to let this moment pass without standing witness to what it would reveal about the city she still called home. Slipping into a seat near the center aisle, Ariana adjusted her skirt with practiced grace, crossing her ankles at the base of the bench, her back straight but relaxed. She placed her handbag gently on her lap, lacing her fingers together as she let her gaze drift toward the front of the courtroom where Judge Alice Whitaker sat perched behind the towering mahogany bench, adjusting her glasses with one hand as she reviewed the stack of papers in front of her. The judge hadn't noticed her yet, or if she had, she showed no sign of it. Ariana didn't mind. She wasn't here for recognition. The distant sound of a cough broke the stillness for a moment, followed by the shuffle of feet as a few late arrivals slipped into the back rows. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and paper. But beneath that, Ariana could sense something Elsean undercurrent of nervous energy that seemed to hum through the room like a low electric current, impossible to see but too strong to ignore. People leaned in toward one another, whispering quietly behind cupped hands, glancing toward the defense table where the accused politician sat with his lawyers, staring straight ahead as if he couldn't hear the whispers or feel the weight of every eye on him. Ariana shifted her attention back to the people around her, noticing the subtle ways their bodies betrayed, the tension they carried: tight shoulders, clenched jaws, hands gripping the backs of benches just a little too hard. This wasn't just about politics. This was personal for everyone in this room, for the woman 2 rows ahead who had lost her home because of the policies this man had pushed through, for the man near the back who had watched his small business collapse while city contracts were quietly funneled to friends of the accused, for the elderly couple holding hands near the wall who had lived long enough to see corruption dressed up as progress more times than they could count. Ariana let her eyes drift closed for just a breath, feeling the quiet hum of collective hope and quiet dread filling the space around her. She knew these people. She had grown up in these neighborhoods, sat in these churches, walked these streets. She knew the price they had paid for every empty promise, every backroom deal, every moment someone in power had looked the other way. That's why she was here. Not to be seen, not to make headlines, but to bear silent witness to whatever justice or injustice this day might bring. And so she sat, perfectly still, breathing in the thick, heavy air of the crowded courtroom, allowing herself one final moment of stillness before the judge called the room to order. She didn't know exactly what would happen next. None of them did. But one thing was certain: this room, this moment, this gathering of faces both familiar and unknown, was already holding its collective breath, waiting for the first word to fall like a stone into the silence. And as Ariana slowly opened her eyes again, settling her hands more firmly on her lap, she felt it, the unmistakable truth that whether the people in this room realized it yet or not, something had already begun to shift beneath the surface. The steady murmur of the courtroom hadn't yet settled when the side doors creaked open again, just barely enough to let in one more figure moving carefully into the space. A man, older than most in the room, with thinning gray hair and a worn brown jacket hanging loose on his thin shoulders, shuffled forward, leaning heavily on a wooden cane that looked as if it might snap under his weight if he wasn't careful. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, as though every step took more from him than he was willing to show. People seated nearby shifted slightly, glancing in his direction, offering polite smiles or leaning aside to make room without fully looking away from the front of the courtroom. The old man's shoes scraped softly against the polished floor as he made his way down the side aisle, each step punctuated by the dull tap of his cane. No one thought much of it at first, after all. It wasn't unusual to see elders from the community show up on days like this, their presence a quiet reminder of the history these walls had already witnessed. But near the back, standing just inside the entrance with his arms crossed, Officer Bradley Cooper watched the man with a different kind of interest, his jaw tightening slightly, as he leaned toward Sanders, without taking his eyes off the old man's slow, careful progress. "Watch this," Bradley muttered under his breath, the corners of his mouth curling into something dangerously close to a smirk. Sanders gave him a sideways glance, his brow raised just enough to suggest skepticism, but Bradley didn't explain further. He didn't need to. He could already feel the itch of opportunity rising in his chest like static before a storm. Bradley knew this courtroom like he knew the back of his own hand, the flow of bodies, the way attention shifted, the blind spots no one noticed unless they were paid to look for them. And right now, every pair of eyes was drifting toward the old man and his slow, awkward shuffle toward the front. It wasn't a scene anyone would describe as suspicious, not on the surface, but for Bradley, it was the perfect moment, the kind of small distraction that let him move without drawing the kind of attention that turned heads for the wrong reasons. He took a slow breath, rolled his shoulders back, and uncrossed his arms as he started to move. Each step casual but purposeful, angling himself down the far side of the courtroom toward the center row where Ariana Bennett had taken her seat. She hadn't moved since she sat down. Her posture still calm, composed, her hands folded lightly on her lap, but Bradley could feel something sharp and quiet in the air between them, like a tripwire stretched just out of sight. He didn't look directly at her as he approached. Instead, he let his gaze follow the old man, as if he were simply monitoring the flow of traffic, performing his duty like any officer would. His boots made almost no sound on the thick carpet runner as he moved closer, weaving between the benches with a practiced ease that felt like second nature. Closer now. Bradley let his hand drift to his utility belt, fingers resting casually on the edge of his badge, his palm brushing the cool surface like a silent reminder of who had the authority in this room. He stopped 2 steps behind Ariana, just outside her peripheral vision, tilting his head slightly, as if surveying the room while his focus narrowed in on the back of her head, the way her long, sleek black hair framed her shoulders without a single strand out of place. For a moment, he simply stood there, waiting, measuring the air between them like a man standing at the edge of a frozen lake, testing the ice with the weight of his own breath. And then, with a breath so quiet it barely stirred the space around him, he shifted his stance, leaning in just enough for his voice to reach her ear without disturbing the rest of the room. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone low but firm, the kind of voice that sounded polite on the surface but carried a sharp edge beneath it, like a blade tucked into a velvet glove. "Can I see some identification, please?" Ariana didn't flinch. She didn't turn to look at him right away. Instead, she let the silence hang between them for half a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if weighing whether or not to acknowledge him at all. When she finally did turn, slowly, gracefully, her expression remained unreadable, her dark eyes steady as they met his without even the smallest flicker of surprise. She reached into her handbag with deliberate care, her movements calm, unhurried, as if she had done this 100 times before. And when she pulled out her badge, the same badge Bradley had already seen more than once on news broadcasts and official reports, she held it up between them, not with defiance, not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she had earned. Bradley didn't reach for it, not yet. He let his gaze drop to the badge for a moment, studying the lettering, the seal, the name printed in bold black letters. Ariana Bennett, federal prosecutor, Southern District of Georgia. It was legitimate. He knew it. But something inside him, something small and sharp and rooted in every bad instinct he'd ever trusted, told him it didn't matter. He leaned back just slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching towards something that might have been a smile if it weren't so thin. "Mind if I take a closer look?" he asked, already knowing she didn't really have a choice. And just like that, with the faintest nod of her chin, Ariana placed the badge into his waiting hand, her fingers brushing lightly against his glove as she let go. Bradley closed his fingers around the badge, turning it over slowly between his palms, feeling the smooth, worn edges press against his skin. Behind them, the old man with the cane finally reached the front row, settling heavily into an empty seat with a tired sigh that seemed to ripple through the courtroom like the closing of a door. The distraction was over. The room had settled again, but Bradley's mind had already moved on. Because now, standing just inches away from the woman who carried herself like she owned the world, Bradley Cooper knew one thing. With absolute certainty this wasn't over. Not yet. And with that quiet thought simmering just beneath the surface, he slid the badge into his palm a little tighter and took his next breath just a little slower, as if savoring the moment before the real game began. Bradley let the badge sit in his palm just a second longer than necessary, turning it between his fingers as if searching for some flaw, some sign that it wasn't as real as it looked. His jaw tightened slightly as he leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to keep their exchange private, but loud enough that anyone sitting close might catch the edge in his tone. "Funny," he said, barely above a whisper. "We've had a lot of fakes come through here lately. You'd be surprised how convincing some of them look." Ariana didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't even shift in her seat. She let the silence hang for just a heartbeat longer, letting the weight of his words settle between them like dust in a still room. Then, without changing the calm, steady rhythm of her breath, she met his eyes with a look so level, so completely unmoved, it might have felt like a slap to someone less stubborn than Bradley Cooper. "Then I suggest you read it again," she replied quietly, her voice smooth as glass, steady as a pulse. Bradley straightened, pushing out a breath through his nose like he was forcing down something bitter. He knew what he was holding was real. The badge was legitimate. The credentials were official. But something about her composure, something about the way she refused to be rattled-burned under his skin in a way that made it impossible to let it go. He looked around the courtroom, scanning the faces nearby. No one was paying attention, not yet. But the room was restless, on edge, like a lit fuse waiting to burn down to its final spark. He could feel it pressing against his ribs, that tightening coil of something that dared him to push a little harder. So, he leaned down again, this time letting his shadow fall across her lap as he spoke a little louder, just enough to let the people around them catch the shift in his tone. "You sitting in a restricted section, ma'am," he announced, his voice coated with mock authority. "This row is reserved for court officials and designated personnel only." The words hung in the air like an accusation, sharp enough to make the heads nearest them start to turn, curious glances sliding toward the confrontation unfolding in real time. Ariana knew exactly what he was doing. She could feel the temperature in the room shift, could feel the subtle ripple of attention settling on her like a heavy coat. And yet, she refused to break her posture. She tilted her head slightly, folding her hands more tightly over her bag, locking her fingers together until her knuckles turned just a shade paler than the rest of her skin. She kept her voice even controlled, each word dropping with deliberate weight. "I am a court official," she said softly, tilting her chin just enough to remind him that she was not afraid to speak louder if he forced her to. Bradley's lips curled into something between a grin and a sneer, a small, satisfied exhale escaping through his teeth as he let the moment stretch. He turned slightly toward the rest of the courtroom, raising his voice just enough to fill the growing silence. "That's so?" he called out, holding the badge higher now, turning it so that anyone nearby could see it glint under the overhead lights. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks an awful lot like someone trying real hard to play a role." The words weren't just for her anymore. They were for everyone. For the curious onlookers who now leaned in a little closer, their quiet murmurs like dry leaves rustling underfoot. Ariana felt the heat rise behind her ears, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that simmered beneath the surface of her skin like the steady burn of a slow, controlled fire. She shifted in her seat, not to retreat, but to ground herself more firmly, planting both feet flat on the floor, pressing her shoulders back until her spine straightened like steel drawn tight across her frame. She reached for the badge in his hand, holding his gaze with an expression that didn't waver, didn't bend, didn't yield. "Return my credentials," she stated quietly, but the edge in her voice was unmistakable, like the click of a lock snapping into place. For a fraction of a second, Bradley hesitated. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavier than he expected. But pride familiar, stubborn, reckless, pride tightened his grip around the badge for 1 second too long. And in that second, something shifted in the air between them, sharp enough that even Sanders, standing a few feet away, turned his head with the smallest flicker of doubt crossing his face. But Bradley didn't back down. Not yet. Instead, he stepped in closer, his shadow swallowing the space between them entirely. The badge remained in his grip, and the words that came next slipped from his lips like oil on water, thick and slow, and full of something colder than authority. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear the threat laced beneath it. "Let's take this somewhere else." Ariana didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply sat there, as still and silent as stone, her breath slow and steady, as if she were counting down from a number only she knew. And in that pause so small, so precise, it became clear to anyone paying attention that the next move wouldn't belong to him. It would belong to her. And in that frozen second, sitting in a room full of people holding their breath without even knowing it, Ariana Bennett knew something Bradley Cooper would never understand. Control wasn't something you took. It was something you never gave away. The air seemed to thicken as the silence stretched between them, a silence heavy enough to make the people nearby shift uneasily in their seats, as if sensing the temperature of the room had dropped by just a few degrees. Ariana could feel the weight of 100 unspoken assumptions pressing against her skin, not from Bradley alone, but from the eyes starting to turn in their direction, slow and curious, like strangers watching a crack form in a dam they didn't dare admit was about to burst. Bradley's stance shifted again, just slightly, but it was enough. His body leaned in a little closer, his shadow creeping over her like a wave about to break. The badge still rested in his hand, but his grip on it had become less about procedure and more about posturing, more about sending a silent message that only one of them was supposed to hear. Ariana held his gaze a moment longer, her breathing controlled, her face unreadable. But she knew exactly what he was trying to do. She had seen it too many times before, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in hallways, lined with men who mistook intimidation for power. And yet, knowing it didn't make it any less exhausting, didn't make it sting any less. It was the weight she carried quietly every day, the cost of daring to take up space where she was never expected to stand. She leaned back ever so slightly, tilting her chin as if to remind herself that she had survived worse than this. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, to draw the boundary that should have never needed drawing, Bradley acted faster. Without warning, he took a half step forward, closing the last few inches of space between them, and grabbed her left arm knot with force, not enough to bruise, but just enough to violate the air between them, just enough to send a ripple of visible discomfort through the nearby rows. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," he announced, louder now, his voice slicing through the restless murmurs like a blade across glass. The words hung in the air like an accusation, sharp and public, designed to gather attention, designed to paint her as the problem before she could even respond. Heads turned more openly now. People shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, some sitting back, unsure whether they were watching protocol or something far more personal unfold right in front of them. Ariana's heart pounded once, a steady thump deep in her chest, but her face didn't move, didn't falter. She knew if she stood now, if she followed him out under these terms, she would be giving him exactly what he wanted: an audience, a display of control, dressed up as procedure. She could feel the heat rising along the back of her neck, not from fear, but from the quiet, burning injustice of knowing that every eye now watching would remember how she responded to this moment more than anything else she had ever accomplished. She tightened her grip on the edge of the bench, grounding herself, reminding herself that she did not owe this man the performance he was trying to pull her into. And just as she opened her mouth to challenge him again, to demand he release her arm, Bradley made a move she never expected. A move so bold it stole the breath from her lungs before she could find the words. With one swift, deliberate motion, he reached out with his free hand, grabbed hold of her long black wig, and ripped it clean off her head in front of the entire courtroom. The sound wasn't loud. There was no dramatic snap, no sharp crack of fabric tearing. It was quiet, almost unsettlingly quiet, like the breath of air leaving a room when someone slams the door shut. But the impact was deafening. The courtroom gasped as one. The sound rippled through the space like a wave hitting the shore, followed by a stunned silence that pressed down on every single person present. Even Judge Whitaker, who had been scribbling notes on the bench, froze mid-sentence, her pen hovering just above the paper. Ariana sat frozen for half a heartbeat, her scalp tingling with shock, her body rigid with disbelief. She could feel the cool air of the room settling on her exposed, natural curl short, tight, unprocessed and, though she had nothing to be ashamed of, though her natural hair was hers alone to wear with pride, the violation stung deeper than she expected. Because it wasn't just the wig, it wasn't just the exposure. It was the knowing smirk curling on Bradley's face, the quiet hum of a few soft chuckles from the back of the room, the way some people leaned in as if this moment, this humiliating, dehumanizing act, was somehow entertainment to be consumed like cheap drama on daytime television. Somewhere in the back, Clara Bennett stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. But she didn't speak, didn't move forward. She simply stood there, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line, her fists clenched tight at her sides, as if holding herself back from crossing the room entirely. Ariana could feel her mother's eyes on her, could feel the burn of every watching face, waiting, measuring, silently daring her to react in a way they could turn into a headline or a whisper campaign. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the edges of her composure threaten to crack, not from shame, but from the unbearable weight of knowing that even here, even now, she was still expected to endure without breaking. She reached down slowly, deliberately, and picked up the wig from where it had fallen to the floor beside her seat. Her fingers closed around the strands, carefully, gently, as though reclaiming something sacred. She sat perfectly still, holding it in her lap, breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth, until the pounding in her ears softened just enough to hear the quiet tremble of the room settling around her once more. And then, without looking up, without saying a single word, Ariana Bennett leaned back against the bench, placed the wig neatly beside her handbag, and closed her eyes for just a moment longer than anyone expected, long enough to remind herself of who she was, long enough to decide that she would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't the one you give aloud. It's the silence you refuse to fill with anything less than your dignity. Bradley Cooper stood there, towering over Ariana like a man who had just planted his flag in conquered territory, his chest rising and falling with the shallow kind of breath that feeds itself on the illusion of power. His hand, the same hand that had ripped away her wig without hesitation, now rested casually on his duty belt, thumb hooked near the holster as if to remind her and everyone else who held the authority here. For a split second, he scanned the crowd, catching a few lingering glances, the nervous flicker of eyes darting away as soon as they met his. He fed on that silence, the kind that stretched between discomfort and confusion, the kind that made people question whether they'd really seen what they just saw, or whether their mind was playing tricks on them. Bradley knew the difference between a room full of outrage and a room full of hesitation, and right now, hesitation hung thick in the air like fog after a summer storm. Ariana sat motionless, her breathing steady but shallow, the wig still resting quietly in her lap. She could feel the weight of it, not the physical weight light as it was, but the emotional gravity of what it represented. Years of silently calculating how to walk into rooms like this and be seen as more than just her skin, her gender, or the assumptions tied to both. She had worn that wig not out of shame, but because she knew what the world did with black women who dared to show up too boldly, too naturally, too unapologetically themselves. Now, here she was, stripped of that layer of armor by a man who had no understanding of what it cost her to build that image in the first place. And still, even after all that, she refused to let him see her flinch. She lifted her chin, ever so slightly, pressing her palms flat against her thighs to ground herself in the one thing he hadn't managed to take away her control over her own reaction. Bradley, sensing the moment slipping, leaned in again, closer than before, close enough that Ariana could feel the faint heat of his breath brushing the edge of her cheek. His voice dropped low, meant only for her, carrying the kind of arrogance that oozes from men who think they've already won. "Didn't think you'd go quiet on me?" he murmured, the words sliding like oil off his tongue. "What's wrong? Run out of things to say?" Ariana turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting his with such cold precision that for the first time all morning, Bradley's smirk faltered just barely, but enough for her to notice. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence hit harder than anything she could have said in that moment. And he felt it. That's what made him step back, jaw tightening, his fingers curling into fists at his sides, as if the quiet had suddenly become too much to bear. He cleared his throat, straightened his back, and raised his voice again, turning slightly toward the courtroom as if putting on a show for the small crowd that had begun to lean in, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. "Go ahead and stand up, ma'am," he announced, louder this time, like a man trying to regain ground he never really had. "We need to verify your credentials with courthouse security." More heads turned, more whispers stirred, people shifting in their seats, some looking toward the front where Judge Whitaker was still frozen in unreadable silence, her hands pressed firmly on the bench, her jaw visibly clenched. Ariana's mother, Clara, had not sat down since she stood earlier. She stood perfectly still near the back, gripping the back of the pew in front of her so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She opened her mouth once, as if to call out to her daughter, but stopped herself, pressing her lips together until the words dissolved into the tightness in her throat. Ariana closed her eyes for the briefest moment, exhaling through her nose like a woman bracing for impact. She reached for her bag, slid the wig gently inside, and pushed herself to her feet with a grace so deliberate it seemed to slow the air around her. She turned to face Bradley fully now, standing eye to eye with the man who had humiliated her without so much as a flicker of accountability. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't break her stance. She simply stood there, one breath at a time, reminding everyone in that courtroom, including Bradley, that dignity wasn't something anyone could strip away without permission. And in that frozen moment, before she took a single step forward, Ariana did something no one expected. She smiled. Not wide, not loud, not the kind of smile meant to perform. It was a small, knowing, smile, sharp, controlled, and terrifyingly calm. It was the kind of smile that made Bradley's jaw twitch as he instinctively shifted his weight, his bravado slipping just enough to show the first crack in his performance. Because deep down, even if he didn't understand why, Bradley Cooper knew he hadn't won anything. Not yet. And as Ariana stood there, staring him down in the thick silence of that packed courtroom, she knew something he hadn't figured out yet. She hadn't even started fighting back. For a few unbearable seconds, the air in the courtroom felt like it had been vacuumed clean of sound, like someone had pressed pause on the entire world, while everyone waited to see what would happen next. You could almost hear the weight of 100 held breaths pressing against the walls, the ceiling, the very floor beneath their feet. Even Bradley, standing squarely in front of her with that stubborn look still tightening his jaw, seemed caught in the heavy stillness he himself had created. His fingers twitched ever so slightly at his sides, like a man realizing too late that the moment he thought he controlled had suddenly turned into something far more fragile, something that could collapse on him with a single wrong move. Ariana stood there, perfectly still, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, breathing slow and steady, as if she'd spent a lifetime preparing for this exact moment. She felt the heat rising behind her eyes, not from anger, but from the deep, hollow ache of knowing she had been here before, maybe not in this room, not in this exact way, but in the silent crosshairs of people who had always doubted her place, her right to exist on equal footing. And yet, in the thick of that silence, something else began to rise beneath the surface, something calmer, something deeper than fear or humiliation. It was a quiet reckoning, a steady voice in the back of her mind, reminding her that she had nothing left to prove to men like him. She had done the work. She had paid the price. She had earned her place in this world 1,000 times over. The temptation to speak too soon, to lash out, to give him the reaction he clearly wanted, hung on the edge of her tongue like a sharp stone waiting to be thrown. But she knew better. She knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was make a man like Bradley Cooper sit in the very silence he had created, make him feel the weight of his own actions echoing back at him, louder than any defense he could scramble together. She let the seconds stretch, long enough for the unease in the room to shift from her to him, long enough for people to start noticing that it wasn't her face turning red with effort, but his, long enough for the nervous coughs and shuffling feet around them to settle into something much colder judgment. Bradley shifted again, clearing his throat like a man trying to climb out of a hole he hadn't realized he'd dug so deep. His eyes darted, not toward Sanders this time, but toward the judge's bench, looking for some kind of validation, some kind of backup that wasn't coming. Judge Whitaker hadn't moved an inch, her expression locked in something between disbelief and simmering disapproval, her pen still resting mid-air above her notebook like she'd forgotten what she was writing the moment this circus began. And that was when Ariana knew the balance had shifted. Not because she had shouted, not because she had fought back with fists or fury, but because she had let him fill the silence with his own weakness, his own discomfort, his own desperate need to control something that was never his to begin with. She reached down, slow and steady, picking up her badge from where Bradley had dropped it on the bench beside her. She brushed her thumb across the smooth metal, not to clean it, not to polish it, but as a small act of reclaiming what had never truly left her hands. When she finally looked up again, locking eyes with him one last time, there was no venom in her gaze, no firestorm waiting to explode. There was only clarity, sharp, still, unshakable clarity. She parted her lips, drew in a quiet breath, and held it for a single heartbeat longer, standing as if she were carved from stone. And then, without raising her voice, without moving an inch closer, she whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "You've made your choice." The words hung in the air like a quiet verdict, soft but final. Bradley blinked once, shoulders tensing, as if some small part of him had hoped she would shout, that she would lash out, that she would give him something to write up in his report later as justification for this entire performance. But instead, she had left him standing there, alone in the silence he couldn't seem to fill, the weight of every eye in that courtroom now shifting to him with growing suspicion. And in that moment, for the very first time since she had entered the room, Ariana Bennett knew she had won something far more valuable than the upper hand. She had won the room's attention, but more importantly, she had won its respect. And as the air slowly returned to the courtroom, first as a ripple, then as a wave of murmurs and shifting glances, Ariana let her hands fall calmly to her sides, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet like it had always belonged to her, because it had. It always had. There are moments in life so fragile, so impossibly stretched thin, that the air itself seems to stop moving, as if the very walls are holding their breath right along with the people trapped between them. And as Ariana Bennett stood in that courtroom, face to face with a man so desperate to prove her small that he had humiliated himself instead, she knew she was standing in one of those moments. The tension in the room had shifted, not in a wave, not in an explosion, but in something quieter, something sharper. It was as if the people in the courtroom, one by one, had started to see through the noise, through the performance, through the thinly veiled authority Bradley Cooper had wrapped himself in like a cheap costume. They weren't leaning in to watch her anymore. They were watching him, and he felt it. Bradley swallowed hard, his throat tightening around a breath that seemed to stick somewhere just below his Adam's apple. He shifted his stance again, his weight leaning back just slightly, as if the ground beneath him had started to feel less certain than it had only moments ago. For the first time since this entire thing began, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a crack in the armor of false confidence he had worn like a second skin. Ariana saw it. She felt it. And in that sliver of hesitation, in that breath between dominance and doubt, she knew exactly what she had to do. She took one step forward, slow and deliberate, not aggressive, not hurried, but grounded-rooted like an old oak tree that had survived every storm ever thrown against it. She held her badge up again, high enough for the entire room to see, and then, with a voice so calm it cut sharper than any shout could have, she spoke the sentence that would leave the air trembling in its wake. "You just assaulted the federal prosecutor of this district, in front of this entire courtroom." The words didn't rise like thunder, they didn't crash like a wave. They fell like stone-heavy, undeniable, unshakable. The reaction was almost imperceptible at first. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the back. The creak of someone shifting in their seat a little too quickly. The soft gasp of a woman covering her mouth with her hands as the reality of what had just been spoken settled like dust on every surface in the room. Bradley froze, his face drained of color in a way that no performance could hide. His jaw tensed, his hands twitched, and for the briefest second, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Whatever he had planned to say, whatever excuse he had been holding on to, died in his throat before it could reach the air. Judge Whitaker's gavel didn't move. Her pen didn't shift, but her eyes, sharp, steely, and unblinking, lifted slowly from the papers on her bench and locked onto Bradley with a weight so heavy it could have crushed a lesser man where he stood. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, full of understanding, full of the quiet, collective acknowledgement that the power in this room had just changed hands. Ariana didn't lower her arm. She didn't break eye contact. She let the badge hang there, steady as a heartbeat, daring anyone to challenge what had already been laid bare for all to see. Bradley took half a step back, his boots scuffing slightly against the floor, as if his body had finally registered what his pride had refused to admit. His lips parted again, this time trembling slightly at the edges. But before he could form a single word, Judge Whitaker's voice rang out, low and controlled, slicing clean through the thick air like a razor through silk. "Officer Cooper," she called, her voice colder than the air-conditioned hum of the ceiling vents above them. "Step away from Miss Bennett, right now." The command hit like a hammer. Bradley flinched, his jaw locking tight as he slowly raised his hands, palms open, as if surrendering to a weight far heavier than any badge could carry. He stepped back, inch by inch, until there was nothing but open space between him and Arianaspace that now belonged to her, claimed not through force, but through presence, through truth, through the unshakable authority that had always been hers to begin with. Ariana lowered her arm, placed her badge back inside her bag with careful precision, and let out a long, steady breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She could feel her mother's presence behind her, still standing, still holding her ground, as if rooted there by something deeper than fear, something stronger than anger pride. The room didn't erupt, no one cheered, no one clapped, but everyone knew. And sometimes, that knowing was louder than any sound could ever be. Ariana didn't need to say another word, because she had already said the only one that mattered. The silence after Judge Whitaker's command lasted no longer than a few seconds, but somehow it felt longer stretched, thin and sharp, like glass pulled to its breaking point. All eyes stayed on Bradley Cooper, as if the entire room, from the judge to the spectators to the officers posted at the back wall, had frozen him in place with nothing more than the weight of collective expectation. Bradley stood motionless, his hands still raised, breathing unevenly through clenched teeth. His face paling under the weight of what he had just realized. His body seemed smaller now, not physically, but in presence. The smug, performative energy he had carried like armor had cracked wide open, exposing something far more fragile underneath fear. It wasn't the fear of Ariana, though he should have known better. It wasn't even the fear of the glares now coming from the gallery. No. This was the fear of authority, real authority staring him down from the judge's bench, reminding him that his badge did not place him above the very laws he had sworn to enforce. The soft scrape of the judge's chair pushing back echoed across the chamber like a match-striking stone. Judge Whitaker stood slowly, pressing both palms flat on the polished mahogany surface in front of her, her gaze locked on Bradley with the kind of controlled fury only a woman who had seen too many men like him could muster. Her voice was quieter now, but somehow more dangerous. "You're done here, Officer Cooper. Return your badge and your weapon to the bailiff now." You could almost hear the ripple move through the crowd-sharp intakes of breath, hands covering mouths, the tightening grip of disbelief wrapped around every throat. Even Sanders, standing stiff near the back, flinched visibly, his mouth falling open just slightly as if he hadn't expected the judge to go that far. Bradley's throat bobbed once, a hard swallow that seemed to stick halfway down. For the first time since Ariana had walked through those courthouse doors, he looked like a man who no longer knew which way to move. His jaw twitched, his fists clenched and released, clenched again, as though he was silently daring himself to resist, but the weight of the moment had already crushed any defense he might have thought he still held. Ariana stood tall, watching without a single word, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone who had waited her entire career for justice, a note for herself, but for every person who had ever sat in that very courtroom. Powerless, unseen, unheard. Slowly, Bradley reached for his belt with trembling fingers. The sound of the metal buckle unclasping, the soft thud of leather folding, echoed like distant thunder in the dead quiet room. He unhooked his badge first, holding it for just a second longer than necessary, before placing it on the corner of the bailiff's desk, like a man laying down a weapon after a fight he never had the right to start. Then came the service weapon, heavier somehow in that moment, as if its weight had doubled under the realization that his power had never truly belonged to him in the first place. He set it down beside the badge, stepping back with stiff, jerking movements, as though every inch of air between him and the bailiff burned to breathe. The courtroom felt smaller now, like the walls had closed in just enough to let everyone feel the shift in power, tangible, undeniable, irreversible. Judge Whitaker straightened her back and gave a single nod to the two deputies standing near the exit. Without a word, they moved toward Bradley. Not rushing, not hesitating, but walking with the kind of steady authority that left no room for misunderstanding. One reached for his arm not forcefully, not to harm but to escort, to remove, to make it known that this man no longer belonged in this space. Bradley didn't resist, not because he agreed with what was happening, but because something deeper than ego had finally sunken in the unshakable truth that there were lines even he could not cross without consequence. As the officers guided him toward the exit, the air seemed to crackle with something heavier than silence relief. It wasn't loud, it wasn't celebrated, but it was there, in the soft exhale of breath from the people who had sat frozen for too long, waiting to see if justice would be another promise left unfulfilled. Ariana didn't move. She didn't sit. She stood there, unmoving, until the doors closed quietly behind Bradley, sealing the moment like the final page of a chapter long overdue. Her mother, Clara, placed a hand over her heart, and finally, after all that time, let herself sit back down slowly, shoulders trembling with something between pride and exhausted release. She had seen her daughter walk into many rooms in her life, but none like this. None where standing still had shaken the ground beneath so many feet. Ariana let out a slow, steady breath, the kind you take after holding something heavy for far too long. And for the first time all morning, she allowed her fingers to relax, her palms to open, letting the tension fall away one breath at a time. Because the moment was over, and she had won, not just for herself, but for every silent witness who had waited to believe again that the system they feared could still bend toward what was right. It took a few moments for the courtroom to breathe again, as if everyone had forgotten how to move after watching something they never expected to witness. The tension didn't vanish all at once. It slipped out slowly, like steam rising from pavement after a long, heavy rain. People shifted in their seats, exhaled quietly, glanced toward one another with looks that carried both shock and something softer, something that felt a little like relief. Ariana didn't move right away. She stood perfectly still, her hands resting at her sides, her shoulders held back with the kind of quiet strength that didn't ask for attention but commanded it all the same. She knew the moment had passed, the damage done, the room forever changed by what had unfolded. But there was still something raw sitting in her chest, something thick and heavy that she hadn't yet found the breath to release. And then, in the middle of that fragile silence, she heard it. A single pair of footsteps, soft but steady, moving toward her from the back of the room. She knew who it was before she even turned her head. Clara Bennett, standing tall despite the years weighing on her frame, walked down the aisle like a woman carrying generations on her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face was steady as stone, her eyes shimmering, not with tears of grief, but with something far deeper, something fierce and unshaken. She didn't rush, she didn't reach out right away. She simply walked until she stood close enough for Ariana to feel the warmth of her mother's presence, like a blanket being draped softly over her shoulders. And in that moment, without a word needing to be spoken, Ariana turned toward her, meeting her mother's gaze with something that broke the tension she had held in her chest for what felt like hours. Clara lifted her hand, slow and careful, and placed it gently on Ariana's cheek, her thumb brushing just below her eye like she used to do when Ariana was a little girl, standing too proud to let the tears fall. For a moment, they just stood there, mother and daughter, generations apart, but bound by the same battles fought in different decades. "You stood tall, baby," Clara whispered softly, her voice trembling but sure. "You stood tall, and you stood right." Ariana felt her throat tighten, her breath catching somewhere deep and sharp. And before she could stop herself, she leaned in, wrapping her arms around her mother's shoulders, holding on like she hadn't held on in years. The warmth of that embrace filled every hollow space left in her chest, every crack left by the weight of what had almost broken her in front of that crowd. The room stayed respectfully quiet, as if recognizing that this moment didn't belong to anyone else. A few people stood quietly near the back, their hands resting over their hearts, their faces soft with something unspoken but deeply understood. This wasn't just about Ariana. This was about all of them. About the years they had sat in that very room wondering if their voices mattered, wondering if dignity could ever win against power. Judge Whitaker, still standing behind her bench, lowered her pen slowly onto the wooden surface in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. But the faintest nod of her head said everything Ariana needed to hear, that this was over, and that justice, in whatever small way it had arrived, had been served today. Clara finally leaned back, her hands cupping Ariana's face one last time before she smiled a small, knowing smile that carried every lesson, every hardship, every quiet prayer she had ever whispered for her daughter. Then she let go, standing back with the kind of pride that could fill a room without ever needing to speak it aloud. Ariana straightened, smoothing the front of her dress, reclaiming every inch of composure that belonged to her. She turned toward the gallery, meeting the eyes of the people who had watched her walk through fire and come out standing. Some nodded quietly, some placed hands over their heart, and just a few smiled, the kind of smile that told her they had been waiting a long time to see someone like her rise and remain unbroken. She glanced toward the exit, toward the doors that had closed behind Bradley Cooper not 10 minutes earlier. She knew this wasn't the end of it. There would be reports to file, statements to give, and questions to answer, but all of that could wait. Right now, in this moment, she had nothing left to prove to anyone, because she had already proven it to herself. And as she gathered her bag, slipping the wig back inside without shame or apology, she knew she would never wear it the same way again. Not because she had lost something, but because she had gained something far more powerful: the freedom to stand fully in her truth, uncovered, unshaken, and unafraid. She turned to her mother one last time, her voice soft but steady. "Let's go home." And with those simple words, spoken not for the crowd but for herself, Ariana Bennett walked out of that courtroom not as a woman defeated, but as a woman who had just reminded an entire city what real power looks like when it refuses to bow. The hallway outside the courtroom felt different, wider, quieter, almost softer somehow, as if the weight of what had just happened hadn't yet reached beyond those heavy wooden doors. The walls, lined with framed portraits of judges long retired, seemed to stand as silent witnesses, their painted eyes frozen in time, watching history unfold in ways they never could have imagined. The polished floors reflected the overhead lights like glassy water, each step Ariana took echoing softly through the empty corridor. She walked with purpose, but not with haste. Her body carried the exhaustion of the fight, the subtle tremble that came after holding yourself together for too long. Clara walked just a step behind, close enough to catch her if her knees ever gave out, though both of them knew Ariana wouldn't let that happen, not out here. Not now. As they neared the exit, the sound of muffled voices began to rise, a quiet wave of whispers, and soft footsteps growing louder with every step forward. Ariana glanced toward her mother, unsure of what might be waiting on the other side of those glass doors. But Clara, with her years of wisdom etched into every line on her face, gave her daughter a small nod, the kind that said, "Whatever's out there, you've already won." When they pushed through the doors, the sight that greeted them stopped Ariana in her tracks. Dozens of people stood gathered in the courthouse, lobby neighbors, church members, community leaders, strangers she'd never met but somehow felt she'd known her whole life. Their faces weren't angry. They weren't shouting or demanding justice. They were simply waiting for her. For a moment, Ariana felt the pressure rise in her throat, the lump that comes when your body realizes the world sees you in ways you hadn't dared to hope they would. She stood frozen, unsure of what to say, unsure if she even could. And then, someone near the front of the crowd stepped forward. A woman in her 60s, wearing a lavender church dress and soft white gloves, her silver hair pinned back neatly beneath a small matching hat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just reached out, taking Ariana's hand in both of hers, squeezing gently like a grandmother, steadying a child who had just done something far braver than anyone expected. Behind her, others began to move one by one, not in a rush, but in a slow, steady wave of quiet affirmation. Some nodded. Some reached out with trembling hands. Some whispered, "Thank you," so softly it barely carried through the air, but it didn't have to. Ariana felt it in her chest, deep and warm, settling into places she hadn't even realized had gone cold. Clara stood just behind her, smiling through tears that refused to fall, holding her hands over her heart like she could barely believe what she was seeing. And for the first time in a long time, Ariana let herself be held by something bigger than her own, resolve held by a community that had silently carried her, even when she didn't know they were there. The air was thick with something sacred, something you can't fake, something that lives only in moments when a community recognizes its reflection in the courage of someone who dared to stand. Ariana felt their hands on her shoulders, on her back, on her arms, not pulling, not demanding, but anchoring her in the kind of connection she had almost forgotten how much she needed. She turned slowly toward Clara, her voice barely louder than a breath. "I didn't think they'd show up," she whispered, her throat thick with emotion she hadn't yet dared to release. Clara stepped closer, wrapping her arms around her daughter's shoulders, pressing her forehead gently to Ariana's temple like she had done when Ariana was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. "Oh, baby," Clara whispered back, her voice breaking just enough to betray the tears she had tried so hard to hold. "We were always here. We never left." And that was the truth. Through the long nights, through the whispered doubts, through every step that had brought Ariana to this moment, they had been there. Quiet, steady, waiting. Not just for her to stand up, but for the world to finally see that she had always belonged. Ariana pulled back just enough to meet her mother's eyes, smiling softly through the ache in her chest. She reached for Clara's hand, lacing their fingers together like they had done so many times before, like they would do for as long as there was breath in their lungs. And together, without another word, they walked through the crowd, surrounded not by applause, not by cameras, but by something far more powerful: respect. And as they reached the courthouse doors, pushing them open to the soft light of afternoon spilling across the steps, Ariana paused for just a moment, turning her face toward the sky, closing her eyes as the sunlight warmed her skin. Because in that moment, she knew exactly who she was. And no one, not today, not ever, could take that away again. The sunlight outside the courthouse felt sharper than Ariana expected, not harsh, but bright enough to make her blink, as she and her mother stepped out onto the wide stone steps. The warmth on her skin was real, grounding, but the hum in the air told her peace wouldn't last long. She could hear it before she saw it: the rising buzz of voices, the clicks of camera shutters, the soft thrum of live broadcast equipment being powered on by hands, eager to spin the moment into headlines. Clara tightened her grip on Ariana's arm, just slightly, not to stop her, but as if to say, "Take your time, baby," as if she already knew the crowd waiting just beyond the steps wasn't here to listen quietly like the community inside had done. Ariana paused, standing tall at the top of the courthouse steps, scanning the crowd below with the steady gaze of someone who had spent years learning how to face a room full of strangers and hold her ground. There were cameras, at least a dozen, their lenses pointed straight at her like a firing squad of silent witnesses. Microphones stretched toward the steps on long black booms. Reporters jostled in small clusters, speaking into earpieces, adjusting their jackets, whispering cues to their crews as they prepared to broadcast this story far beyond the streets of Savannah. For a moment, Ariana felt that familiar itch, the urge to turn, to walk away, to let the moment belong to someone else. She had already done enough, hadn't she? She had faced the humiliation. She had taken back her voice. She had stood her ground in the face of power. But deep down, beneath the weariness tugging at her ribs, she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every person watching who would never be given a microphone. It was about every woman who had swallowed her words to keep the peace. It was about the community that had gathered, not to be seen by cameras, but to stand silently behind her when it mattered most. So, she drew in a slow breath, pressing her lips together for just a second longer before releasing it. And then, With a grace that felt both rehearsed and deeply human, she began to step down the courthouse stairs toward the crowd. The reporters moved first, closing the gap like a wave rushing toward the shore, their voices overlapping, their questions fired faster than anyone could reasonably answer. "Miss Bennett, what do you have to say about the officer's behavior? Were you surprised by the judge's decision? Do you plan to press charges?" She could have ignored them. She could have walked straight past and climbed into the waiting black sedan parked at the curb. But she didn't. She stopped just a few steps from the crowd, holding up her hand, not high, not demanding attention, but steady, quiet, enough to signal that she was willing to speak on her terms, not theirs. The voices softened, just enough for her to be heard. Ariana glanced toward her mother, feeling Clara's quiet presence behind her like a shield of steady breath. Then she turned back to the crowd, her voice low but clear, carrying not like a rehearsed statement, but like a truth she had waited her whole life to say. "What happened in that courtroom today," she began, her words unhurried, "was not about me alone." The reporters stilled, leaning in closer, their cameras tightening focus. "It was about every person who has ever been humiliated, dismissed, or disrespected, while the world looked the other way. It was about reminding those who hide behind badges, behind power, behind fear, that accountability doesn't stop at the courtroom door." She paused, letting the words settle, not forcing them, not rushing to fill the space they left behind. "I didn't come here today to be a headline. I didn't stand my ground for attention or applause. I stood because I had to. Because silence, in moments like these, is never justice. And I refuse to be silent when so many are still waiting for their moment to be seen." The reporters stayed quiet, holding their breath as if afraid any sound might shatter the weight of what had just been spoken. Even the hum of the city, the distant traffic, the breeze stirring the trees felt like it had softened to let her finish. Ariana lowered her hand, her fingers curling loosely at her side, and with one final glance toward the crowd, she spoke the last words she would offer to the cameras that day. "Hold your power with care, use your voice with purpose, and never let fear decide who you are." With that, she turned back toward Clara, who stood waiting with a knowing smile, her eyes shining with something bigger than pride, something closer to peace. They didn't wait for follow-up questions. They didn't need to, because some statements stand all by themselves. And as they walked toward the waiting car, leaving the flashing cameras and buzzing microphones behind, Ariana knew the story wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, she was the one holding the pen. Bradley Cooper didn't sleep much that night. Long after the courthouse had emptied and the news vans had rolled off into the dark streets of Savannah, his mind kept running in circles like a dog chasing its own tail. Trapped somewhere between disbelief and denial, he had spent most of his life convincing himself that his badge gave him power, that his uniform earned him respect, that people like him didn't answer to people like her. But standing alone in his kitchen at 2 in the morning, staring into the bottom of a glass of cheap whiskey he hadn't even tasted, that illusion had finally begun to crack in places he hadn't dared to look before. It didn't take long for Internal Affairs to reach out. By sunrise, the call had come through formal notice of an investigation, not just into the incident with Ariana Bennett, but into every complaint filed under his name over the last 5 years. Complaints he had ignored, complaints his department had brushed aside, complaints that now, under the weight of a very public humiliation, could no longer be buried. Bradley sat on the edge of his couch, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. The official seal of the department printed at the top in bold black ink. The words blurred as his pulse pounded in his ears, but the message was clear. He was suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. He could almost hear the laughter from the very people he had once looked down on, the officers who had warned him to ease up, the civilians who had learned long ago that their word rarely carried weight against a badge. Even Sanders hadn't answered his call that morning, not even a text. Bradley rubbed a hand over his face, dragging it down his jaw with the kind of slow frustration that burns in the chest long after anger has died. His phone buzzed again on the coffee table, another unknown number, another reporter looking for a statement. He didn't bother answering. What could he possibly say now? Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Ariana sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, staring out the window as the sun began to stretch its light over the rooftops. The morning felt heavier than she expected, not in a way that weighed her down, but in the way a quiet victory settles into your bones after a long, hard fight. She hadn't slept much either, but for different reasons. Her mind had been racing not with fear, not with regret, but with the steady hum of questions she knew would follow. What happens next? Would they follow through? Would the system protect him like it had so many others? Or would this finally be the moment when the walls started to crack for good? The knock on her door was soft, but firm. She stood slowly, tightening the belt of her robe as she crossed the floor, her bare feet cold against the wooden planks. She wasn't expecting visitors, but something in her gut told her this wasn't a neighbor with borrowed sugar or a delivery left on her porch. When she opened the door, 2 agents stood on the other side. One she recognized from the district attorney's office, the other wearing a badge clipped to his belt with the seal of the Department of Justice. Their faces were calm, professional, but their eyes carried something else, something that looked a little like determination. "Miss Bennett," the older agent began, his voice steady but not unkind, "we'd like to ask for your official statement. We're opening a federal inquiry into Officer Cooper's conduct and the department's handling of previous complaints." For a moment, Ariana just stood there, holding the edge of the door, feeling the weight of what those words really meant settle deep in her chest. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But this was movement. She stepped aside, holding the door open wider. "Come in," she said softly, motioning toward the living room. "Let's get this started." And just like that, the quiet of her home was filled with the sounds of chairs scraping softly against the floor, pens clicking open, and questions spoken with the kind of care reserved for moments that carry real consequences. She answered every question without hesitation, her voice steady, her back straight, her words measured but firm. She spoke not just of what had happened that day, but of every moment that had led to it, the years of dismissals, the warnings she'd heard whispered in courthouse hallways, the complaints buried so deep they might have never seen daylight without a public reckoning. The agents took notes, nodding occasionally, their expressions unreadable but not cold. They asked follow-up questions, clarifications, small details that built the foundation of something bigger than one incident. When they stood to leave nearly 2 hours later, the older agent paused by the door, turning back toward her with a look that carried more weight than the badge clipped to his belt. "Thank you for standing your ground," he said simply, his voice softer than before. "Most don't make it this far." Ariana nodded, not out of pride, but out of something closer to resolve. "I didn't have a choice," she replied. "But they do." He nodded once, then stepped outside, leaving her alone once again in the quiet hum of her kitchen. She stood by the window, watching the agents drive away, the sky above just starting to shift from soft pink to bright, clear blue. She didn't know how long the fight ahead would last. She didn't know how many more obstacles they'd try to place in her path, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The door had been opened, and now that the light had started to pour in, there was no closing it again. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond Savannah. It found its way onto national news broadcasts, filtered through the sharp voices of morning anchors and scrolling headlines that tried to shrink something so human into a soundbite. Commentators debated it across studio tables. Social media fed it into millions of timelines, clipped and captioned, shared by strangers who hadn't seen the weight in Ariana's shoulders or the stillness in her mother's hands. Some called it justice, others called it politics. But the people who mattered, most the ones who had filled that courtroom, who had lined the courthouse steps, who had stood quietly in the aftermath, called it something else entirely. They called it hope. For Ariana, life didn't change overnight. She still rose before the sun each morning, still stood in front of her mirror, brushing the tight curls that had once hidden beneath layers of synthetic hair. Only now she did it without apology. Without the small, familiar fear that had once whispered, "Cover up. Smooth it out. Make yourself easier to digest." She didn't hide anymore. She didn't have to. The invitations started trickling in soon after the quiet phone calls, the handwritten notes, the requests to speak at churches, schools, community centers. Not from politicians looking for a headline, but from ordinary people who had seen something in her fight that reminded them of their own. They didn't ask for speeches. They didn't ask for statements. They asked for her presence real, unpolished, steady. And so she went. One Sunday afternoon, just a few blocks from the courthouse, Ariana sat in the back row of a small community center, surrounded by women of all ages, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, some holding babies on their laps, some holding nothing but their breath as they waited for her to speak. She had come prepared with notes, with carefully chosen words about the law and justice and accountability. But as she stood and looked into their faces, she let the papers fall quietly to her side. Because what they needed wasn't more rhetoric. What they needed was the truth. She spoke softly at first, her voice carrying not like a prosecutor, not like a public figure, but like a woman who had been cracked open in front of strangers, and somehow found herself standing taller because of it. She spoke about fear, about standing still when every part of you wants to run, about carrying the weight of generations in the way you walk, the way you speak, the way you refuse to bow when the world dares you to break. She didn't tell them to be brave. She told them they already were. And when she finished, when the last words settled into the quiet hum of that small room, no one clapped, no one stood. They just sat with her in the silence, breathing it in, holding on to it like something sacred. And Ariana knew, in that moment, that legacy wasn't built on headlines or court rulings. It was built on moments like these, small, unseen, but deeply rooted. The Georgia Bar Association reached out next, not with questions, but with recognition. An award, they said, for outstanding integrity and service in defense of public trust. She had accepted it quietly, standing at a podium in front of colleagues who had once doubted if she belonged among them. But as the room rose to its feet in a standing ovation she hadn't asked for, she knew that this moment belonged not to her alone, but to every woman who had ever walked into a room carrying more than her share of the fight. And back home, in that small kitchen with the sun streaming through the window, Clara Bennett sat at the table with her daughter one quiet Saturday morning. No cameras, no crowds, just two women, generations apart, folding laundry and sipping coffee like they had done 100 times before. Clara reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Ariana's, squeezing once, twice, like she used to when Ariana was a child afraid of the dark. "I always knew you'd do more than they ever expected," Clara whispered softly, her voice carrying more pride than any award could ever hold. Ariana looked down at their hands, smiled softly, and let out a long, steady breath. "I'm just getting started, Mama." And as the morning light poured across the table, filling every corner of that quiet house with warmth, Ariana Bennett knew one thing with more certainty than she had ever known anything before. Legacy wasn't something you waited to receive. It was something you chose to build. One moment, one breath, one unshaken stand at a time. And this was only the beginning. Sometimes, life puts us in situations where standing still feels like the hardest thing we'll ever do. It's in those moments when the world seems to turn against us, when voices try to silence us, when power tries to humiliate us, that we're faced with a choice. Do we shrink to make others comfortable, or do we hold our ground with quiet dignity? Ariana's story reminds us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to know that true strength isn't loud, it isn't reckless, it doesn't need applause. True strength is the courage to stand tall when you have every reason to sit down. It's the choice to speak up when silence would be easier. It's the wisdom to know that your worth is not defined by how the world sees you, but by how you see yourself. So, to everyone listening today, let this be a reminder you've already earned your place in this world. You've already proven you belong. You don't have to fight every battle, but when the moment comes, don't be afraid to stand. Because sometimes, standing still is the loudest statement you'll ever make. And if this message spoke to you today, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear these words. We're here to remind you you are never standing alone.